I have witnessed the collapse of maritime empires before. Venice fell not to armies, but to Portuguese ships finding new routes around Africa. The Ottoman stranglehold on eastern trade crumbled when Europeans discovered they no longer needed to pay tribute for passage through Ottoman territories. The Dutch displaced the Portuguese through more efficient commercial networks and superior financial instruments. The British superseded the Dutch through systematic control of global shipping choke points and strategic port facilities. Each collapse followed the same pattern. The established power assumed their advantages were permanent, natural consequences of geography and institutional superiority. They built entire economic systems around controlling routes that seemed impossible to bypass. They negotiated with competitors, as if their dominance was a law of nature rather than a temporary arrangement dependent on specific technological and geographic conditions. Now I watch another empire make the same fatal miscalculation about geography and control. The public believes this is a story about climate change, opening new shipping routes in the Arctic. Environmental scientists focus on ice coverage data and warming trends. Business analysts calculate cost savings and shipping efficiencies. They see tactical adjustments to changing environmental conditions. They do not recognize what I recognize: the systematic dismantling of American control over North American commerce executed through a single port that most Americans could not locate on a map, following the exact historical pattern that has destroyed every maritime empire for the past 5 centuries. Churchill, Manitoba sits on Hudson Bay, 1,000 kilometers north of Winnipeg, connected to the continental rail network by a single line of steel built in 1929 to break the transportation monopolies that had strangled prairie agriculture for decades. The Hudson Bay Railway was conceived as Western Canada's declaration of independence from Eastern financial control, a direct route to European markets that would bypass the freight rate cartels and port handling monopolies that extracted wealth from prairie farmers while adding no productive value. For nearly a century, this vision remained only partially realized. Churchill operated only during the brief ice-free season from July to October, handling modest grain volumes when weather permitted and economics justified the complex logistics of seasonal operations. Transportation economists dismissed it as costly infrastructure maintained for political rather than commercial reasons. American trade analysts never considered it a serious challenge to established shipping networks that moved goods through American ports, American rail systems, and American supply chain management. Even Canadian policymakers treated Churchill as a symbolic gesture toward northern development rather than a strategic national asset. The port represented good intentions about Arctic sovereignty and regional economic development, but generated insufficient revenue to justify major infrastructure investment or systematic integration with southern transportation networks. But I have studied enough maritime history to understand what others missed. Churchill occupies the most strategically positioned deepwater port location in North America, providing the shortest route between the North American interior and both European and Asian markets. The warming Arctic has extended the shipping season from 4 months to 8 months currently, with projections suggesting year-round navigation within the next decade. What began as a seasonal supplement to traditional trade routes has become a primary alternative to American-controlled shipping systems. Every degree of Arctic warming increases Churchill's strategic value while simultaneously reducing American choke point control over North American commerce. This is where empires miscalculate their leverage. They assume geographic advantages are permanent, that control mechanisms established in one era will remain effective indefinitely. They mistake temporary technological limitations for permanent strategic realities. Every maritime empire has made this fundamental error. The Romans controlled Mediterranean trade for 8 centuries through naval superiority and systematic fortification of strategic ports from Cadiz to Alexandria. Roman galleys could intercept any vessel attempting to bypass Roman taxation. Roman ports offered the only reliable harboring, provisioning, and cargo handling services available to long-distance merchants. Roman currency provided the only widely accepted medium of exchange for international transactions. This system seemed permanent because it was comprehensive and mutually reinforcing. But Roman dominance collapsed when barbarian tribes developed sufficient maritime capabilities to establish independent trade networks, and when economic pressures made Roman taxation avoidable rather than mandatory. The infrastructure remained impressive, but it served commerce that had become marginal to the main flows of international trade. The British controlled global commerce for 3 centuries through systematic domination of strategic choke points and maritime technology. British naval bases at Gibraltar, Malta, Suez, Singapore, and Hong Kong could monitor and regulate virtually all international trade between major regions. The Royal Navy's ability to protect friendly shipping while interdicting hostile vessels made British approval essential for most commercial ventures. British financial institutions in London became indispensable intermediaries because British military power guaranteed transaction security. The system also seemed permanent and natural. But British dominance dissolved when other nations developed alternative capabilities, alternative routes, and alternative financial systems. The Suez Canal, initially a British strategic triumph, eventually undermined British control by creating shipping lanes too economically important for any single nation to monopolize without provoking international resistance. The Americans have controlled North American trade for 80 years through dominance of continental transportation infrastructure, using identical logic that sustained Roman and British precedents. Control the essential systems, and you control the commerce that depends on those systems. The Northwest Passage, that mythical route through the Canadian Arctic that claimed countless explorers' lives and frustrated European dreams of Asian trade access for 4 centuries, has become navigable for increasingly long seasons each year. What defeated Sir John Franklin's expedition in 1845, when his ships became trapped in ice and all 129 crew members perished, is now a commercial shipping lane that operates reliably from July through October with draft assessments, suggesting potential year-round navigation within the current decade. This transformation represents more than improved access to a previously unusable route. It constitutes a fundamental alteration of global trade geometry that makes traditional choke points optional rather than mandatory. The strategic implications become clear when examined from the perspective of Asian-European trade flows, which represent the largest and most valuable shipping volumes in the global economy. The Northwest Passage eliminates vulnerabilities by providing Asian shippers with direct access to North American and European markets through waters controlled exclusively by Canada, a stable democratic nation with consistent maritime policies and predictable regulatory frameworks. Chinese cargo vessels can reach Canadian ports without depending on American goodwill, European cooperation, or Middle Eastern stability. Consider the mathematics of maritime commerce and the cold calculations that determine which routes prosper and which routes become economically obsolete. A cargo vessel traveling from Hamburg to Winnipeg saves 6,400 kilometers by using Churchill rather than traditional routes through American ports on the Great Lakes or the St. Lawrence Seaway. This distance reduction represents 12 days of transit time at standard bulk carrier speeds, approximately $620,000 in fuel costs per voyage at current marine diesel prices, and elimination of multiple port fees, canal tolls, pilotage charges, and customs processing delays that add both time and expense to traditional routing. In an industry where profit margins are measured in cents per ton kilometer and where small cost advantages become decisive, competitive factors when multiplied across thousands of annual voyages, this routing advantage is sufficient to redirect entire trade flows from established systems to new alternatives. International shipping companies operate under such competitive pressure that they cannot ignore cost savings of this magnitude without risking their commercial viability. More significantly, the Churchill route eliminates what transportation economists call transit dependencies, the requirement that cargo must pass through systems controlled by third parties who can impose fees, delays, or restrictions for reasons unrelated to the commercial transaction itself. Cargo flowing through American ports must comply with American environmental regulations, security procedures, and customs requirements regardless of the cargo's ultimate origin or destination. Ships using American Great Lakes systems must employ American pilots for certain passages and potentially face delays due to American domestic political considerations. The Churchill alternative removes these dependencies entirely while providing superior economic performance. Canadian cargo flowing through Hudson Bay operates under Canadian jurisdiction exclusively. International shippers dealing directly with Canadian port authorities interact only with Canadian regulatory systems, Canadian customs procedures, and Canadian transportation networks without any requirement for American approval or American oversight. For the first time since the St. Lawrence Seaway opened in 1959, Canadian goods can reach global markets without crossing American territory or using American infrastructure. Canadian wheat loaded at Churchill travels directly to European buyers without American intermediation, inspection, or taxation. Canadian minerals flow to Asian markets without American port handling, customs processing, or supply chain oversight. Canadian trade relationships develop independently of American foreign policy positions, trade disputes, or domestic political considerations. The Americans built their continental hegemony on the assumption that all significant trade flows would eventually pass through their control systems. This was not accidental geography, but deliberate strategic architecture, constructed over more than a century of coordinated investment and policy development. The Great Lakes shipping network, expanded and systematically improved since the 1800s, was designed to capture Canadian trade flows that might otherwise seek alternative routes. The St. Lawrence Seaway, a joint Canadian-American project completed in 1959, was structured to ensure American oversight of Great Lakes shipping even when cargo originated and terminated in Canadian territory. The transcontinental railroad networks, built with substantial government subsidies and land grants, were positioned to serve as mandatory intermediaries for cargo moving between Canadian regions and international markets. American port facilities on both Atlantic and Pacific coasts were expanded and modernized specifically to capture Canadian import and export flows that could not be efficiently handled through smaller Canadian ports with limited international connections. This strategic architecture was comprehensive and mutually reinforcing. Canadian exporters found American systems more efficient and cost-effective than Canadian alternatives. Canadian importers discovered that American distribution networks provided better access to international suppliers. Canadian transportation companies developed operational procedures and business relationships that assumed integration with American systems rather than competition with them. Churchill breaks this architecture permanently and irreversibly. I have seen this exact pattern in the historical record multiple times, and the parallels are precise in their essential structure and inevitable in their ultimate consequences. When Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1498, he did not simply discover a new trade route to India. He destroyed Venice's 5-century monopoly on European Asian commerce and shifted the center of European trade power from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic Ocean ports. The Venetian merchants, sophisticated and experienced in international commerce, possessed extensive networks of agents throughout the eastern Mediterranean, advanced financial instruments for managing complex international transactions, and diplomatic relationships with Ottoman officials, who controlled traditional overland routes between Europe and Asia. They had built their prosperity on providing essential intermediation services that no other European power could replicate. Yet they continued operating as if these traditional advantages remained intact and valuable. Venetian diplomatic missions to Lisbon offered Portuguese competitors partnership agreements based on the assumption that Venice could still provide unique services worth paying for. Venetian merchants negotiated with Dutch trading companies as if other Europeans still needed Venetian expertise to access Asian markets profitably. They were catastrophically wrong about the fundamental nature of the change they faced. The new ocean routes meant Venetian intermediation was no longer necessary or economically justified. Portuguese ships could load pepper and cinnamon directly in Indian ports and sail directly to Lisbon without any Venetian involvement. Dutch merchants could establish their own trading posts in Indonesian ports and manage their own Asian supply chains without requiring Venetian knowledge, Venetian connections, or Venetian financial services. The traditional advantages that had made Venice wealthy for centuries: deep knowledge of Eastern markets, established relationships with Asian suppliers, sophisticated banking systems for international transactions, became economically irrelevant when direct ocean routes eliminated the need for Mediterranean intermediaries entirely. Within 2 generations, Venice had declined from Europe's dominant commercial power to a prosperous but strategically marginal regional economy. The parallels with American assumptions about Canadian trade dependency are exact. American policymakers continue to operate as if Canadian commerce must ultimately flow through American systems. They impose tariffs as if Canada has no alternatives. They make diplomatic threats as if geographic dependency guarantees compliance. The Hudson Bay Railway has been transformed from a marginal freight line into a strategic national asset through systematic Canadian investment that demonstrates sophisticated understanding of infrastructure as geopolitical weapon. The Canadian government has committed $67 billion to upgrade this infrastructure. But this is not routine infrastructure maintenance or economic development spending. This is strategic investment designed to create permanent alternatives to American-controlled transportation systems. The technical specifications reveal the scope of Canadian ambition. Installation of thermal siphons to protect the permafrost ensures year-round operability, despite climate change effects that might otherwise make the route seasonally unreliable. Building automated switching systems allows higher volume and faster turnaround times than traditional manual operations. But the most significant element is the integration of these upgrades with broader Canadian transportation networks. New rail connections link Churchill not just to Winnipeg, but to Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal, creating multiple routing options for Canadian exports. Expanded warehouse and storage facilities allow Canadian exporters to accumulate larger shipments and take advantage of favorable shipping schedules without being constrained by immediate transportation availability. This is not infrastructure development. This is the construction of an alternative economic system designed to operate independently of American cooperation or American approval. Every component has been designed not just for efficiency, but for strategic autonomy, ensuring that Canadian commerce can flow through entirely Canadian networks without requiring American permissions, American services, or American oversight. By September 2025, the first post-Panamax container ship had docked at Churchill, loaded with Canadian wheat destined for Germany. The symbolism was precise and deliberate. For the first time in modern history, North American agricultural products were reaching European markets through a route that completely bypassed American control systems. The market response revealed the extent to which global commodity trading had been waiting for alternatives to American-controlled systems. Canadian wheat futures increased 23%, as European buyers recognized they could source directly from Canada without American intermediaries. This price movement represented the elimination of intermediation premiums, the additional costs buyers pay when purchasing through middlemen rather than dealing directly with producers. Potash prices, where Canada controls nearly half of global reserves, jumped 31% as fertilizer companies secured supply agreements that avoided American choke points. These increases reflected fundamental changes in supply chain structure that provided both Canadian producers and international buyers with advantages unavailable through traditional American-controlled networks. These represented permanent shifts in global commodity trading patterns. European food processors could negotiate directly with Canadian grain farmers. Asian steel producers could contract directly with Canadian mining companies. The psychological impact extended beyond price movements to encompass fundamental changes in how international buyers approached North American suppliers. Churchill eliminated the complications that had forced buyers to navigate American systems even when goods never touched American soil. Chinese manufactured goods, traditionally shipped to North American markets through American West Coast ports, can now reach Canadian consumers through Churchill without ever entering American territorial waters. European luxury products can flow to Canadian cities through Hudson Bay rather than through New York or Boston. This represents the end of what maritime strategists call choke point control. The Northwest Passage eliminates American choke point advantages. Canadian goods flowing through Churchill to global markets cannot be interdicted by American naval forces without violating Canadian sovereignty. International cargo reaching Canada through Arctic routes cannot be subjected to American inspection without Canadian consent. Trade relationships developing through these channels operate beyond the reach of American economic pressure. I have observed this dynamic in previous centuries. When the Portuguese established direct sea routes to Asia, they made traditional overland routes strategically irrelevant. The Ottoman Empire, which had grown wealthy controlling trade between Europe and Asia through traditional routes, found their leverage dissolving. When European merchants had alternatives, Ottoman taxes became optional rather than mandatory. American policymakers faced the same erosion of leverage. They can still impose tariffs on goods entering through traditional routes, but when Canadian exporters have alternatives, American tariffs become avoidable rather than unavoidable. They can still restrict access to American ports and transportation networks, but when Canadian commerce can flow through entirely Canadian systems, American restrictions lose their coercive power. The transformation is irreversible because it aligns with geological and technological trends that no policy intervention can reverse. Canadian shippers save money using Churchill because Arctic shipping routes are shorter, less congested, and subject to fewer regulatory complications than traditional routes through American-controlled systems. Market forces now support Canadian independence rather than American dependence, and this economic alignment strengthens as Arctic navigation seasons extend and Canadian infrastructure capabilities continue expanding. Each successful shipment through Churchill demonstrates operational reliability that attracts additional shippers. Each direct trade relationship between Canada and international partners creates commercial precedents that facilitate additional direct relationships. This is where history becomes inevitable rather than contingent on political decisions. When economic incentives align with strategic advantages and technological capabilities, the resulting changes become self-reinforcing and impossible to reverse through policy measures or diplomatic pressure. No amount of American trade concessions can restore Canadian dependence on American systems when Canadian alternatives provide superior cost performance and operational reliability. The Americans built their continental hegemony on the assumption that geography made Canadian dependence permanent, that shared borders and integrated infrastructure created mutual economic benefits too valuable for Canada to sacrifice. They never seriously considered that geographic advantages could be neutralized by technological developments and alternative infrastructure investments. When alternatives became available, Canadian preferences were entirely predictable and economically rational. Every competent business manager prefers independence to dependence when independence provides superior operational results at lower cost and with greater reliability. The ice has melted according to geological processes that operate independently of human policy preferences. The shipping routes have opened according to climatic trends that continue regardless of political considerations. The infrastructure has been built according to economic calculations that prioritize efficiency and profitability over diplomatic courtesy. The Northwest Passage is no longer a theoretical alternative to American-controlled trade systems. It is an operational reality that already processes substantial and increasing volumes of Canadian commerce each shipping season, and that will continue expanding its capacity and market share as Arctic navigation conditions improve. History does not reverse itself for the convenience of established powers who preferred previous arrangements. Maritime trade routes that become economically viable remain viable regardless of the preferences of nations that previously controlled alternative routes. Venice did not regain its monopoly on European-Asian trade. Spain did not restore its exclusive control over New World commerce. Britain did not maintain its dominance over global shipping after other nations developed alternative capabilities. And America will not recover its control over Canadian market access despite whatever economic pressures or political threats Washington may choose to deploy. The fundamental conditions that sustained American dominance over North American commerce have changed permanently. The Cold War's forgotten front has produced its decisive victory, not through military confrontation, but through the patient construction of alternatives that make previous dependencies obsolete. Canada has achieved complete economic independence from the regional hegemon while maintaining all the advantages of geographic proximity and resource complementarity. The age of American trade hegemony in North America has ended. Most people simply have not yet realized the significance of what has already occurred, but public realization is not required for historical processes to continue operating according to their own economic logic. This is how empires end in the modern era, not with dramatic military defeats or diplomatic crises, but with the quiet discovery that their control has become optional rather than necessary, replaceable rather than indispensable.